Mr. Pichai, is Google going to tailor its features to help Joe Biden in the 2020 election?
Congressman, we approach our work, we support both campaigns today. We think political ads is an important part of free speech in democratic societies, and we engage with campaigns, according to law, and we approach our work in a nonpartisan way.
It was a yes or no question. Can you assure Americans today you won't tailor your features to help Joe Biden in the upcoming election?
We support work that campaigns do. I just want to make sure I
understand that. We all do all kinds of online, social media, all kinds of that kind of outreach, that communication. This is a simple question. Can you today assure Americans you will not tailor your features in any way to specifically help one candidate over other? And this what I'm concerned about is you helping Joe Biden over President Trump.
We won't do any work, to politically tilt anything one way or the other. It's against our core values.
But you did it in 2016. There's an email in 2016 that was widely circulated amongst the executives at your company that got public, where Ms. Ileana Murillo, head of your multicultural marketing, talks about the silent donation Google made to the Clinton campaign. And you applauded her work. She points that out in the email. I'm just curious, if you did it in 16, I want to make, in spite of the fact you did it in 16, President Trump won, I just want to make sure you're not going to do it again in 2020.
Congressman, I recall our conversation at that time, and I appreciate your concern. We didn't find any evidence of such activity. And I took the opportunity after our conversation to reinforce to the company. We realized even an appearance could be improper. So we have clearly communicated to our employees any personal political activity, while that's their right, needs to happen on their own time and resources and should avoid any use of company.
Of course, everyone's got their First Amendment rights to campaign for who they want. What they can't do is configure your features to help one candidate over the other. So you might not have found any evidence, but here's what she wrote to the email to a number of key executives in your company. Quote, we push to get out the Latino vote with our features. Second quote, we push to get out the Latino vote with our features in key states. Seems to me those last three words are the real qualifier here. That's electioneering when you're trying to increase the Latino vote in key states. And she'd already communicated that she was supporting Clinton, that she wanted Clinton to win. So when she talks about increasing the Latino vote, which she assumed was going to help candidate Clinton, and she's doing that in key states. It's one thing if you're going to increase the Latino vote around the country. If you're just a good corporate citizen, you're urging people to vote. It's quite another when you're focusing on in key states. And you know what those key states were? Nevada and Florida, the swing states. So again, I want to make sure this isn't going to happen in 2020.
I can assure you that we complied with laws in 2016. As a company, any work we do around elections is nonpartisan. Users do come to us for understanding where polling places are, where to vote, which is the date to vote, what the voting hours are. We are committed to providing that information, and I can assure you that we will approach our work.
So Mr. Pichai, here's the question I think is on so many Americans' minds. They saw the list that we read here earlier on in our opening statements, all the things Google has done. Google is siding with the World Health Organization over anyone who disagrees with them, even though the World Health Organization obviously lied to America, obviously shills for China. Google's siding with them, YouTube is siding with them. We have the history of all the things Google has done and the history of what happened in 2016 in the election, where they obviously, according to one of your multicultural marketing executive, tried to help Clinton. And here we are 97 days before the election, and we want to make sure it's not going to happen again. We want to can you give us two assurances? One, you're not going to try to tailor your features, configure your platform in a way to help Joe Biden. And second, that you're not going to use your search engine to silence conservatives. Can you give us those two assurances today?
Congressman, on our search engine, conservatives have more access to information than ever before.
And we appreciate that. That wasn't the question. Can you assure us today you're not going to try to silence conservatives? And can you assure us today you're not going to try to configure your features as Ms. Murillo said you did for Clinton in 2016? Can you assure us today you're not going to do the same thing for Joe Biden in 2020?
You have my commitment. It's always been true, and we'll continue to conduct ourselves in a neutral way.
Appreciate it. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to redirect your attention to antitrust law rather than fringe conspiracy theories. Mr. Bezos, our investigation.
Mr. Chairman, we have the email. There is no
Excuse me.
fringe.
It's not your time.
Jordan, you do not have the time. Please be respectful of your
when
colleague.
someone directly,
She controls the time.
Put your mask on. Put your mask on.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Raskin,
Mr. Jordan.
you want to
you
talk
do-
about masks.
Mr. Jordan, Ms. Scanlon.
Why would the Deputy
controls the
Secretary of
time.
Treasury unmask
Mr.
Michael Flynn's name, Mr.
Scanlon.
Raskin? And what I want to know
Mr.
is,
Scanlon,
when someone comes
don't
after my
control the
motives for
time.
asking questions, I get a chance to respond.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Great to see that none of you do. Mr. Pichai, I'm worried about Google's market power, how it concentrates that power, and then ultimately how it wields it. Project Maven was a collaboration between Google and the Department of Defense that Google pulled out of, citing ethical concerns. And you made the decision to pull out of that joint venture following receipt of a letter from thousands of your employees saying that Google should not be in the business of war. My question, Mr. Pichai, is did you weigh the input from your employees when making the decision to abandon that project with the United States military?
Congressman, thanks for your concern. As I said earlier, we're deeply committed to supporting the military and the US government. We have undertaken several projects since then. We do take our employees' input into account, but it's one input. We make decisions based on a variety of factors. As a company, we were new in the cloud space at that time. Since then,
thank you. That's a sufficient answer that you did take their feedback into account. And in fact, some of your Googlers have recently sent you a letter where they've asked you to exit other partnerships as a consequence of ethical concerns. They've asked you to stop doing business with American law enforcement, saying that police broadly uphold white supremacy and that Google should not be engaged in any services to police. And as you well know, you provide some of the most basic services to police like email, but you also provide services that help keep our cops safe when they're doing their job. And so my question is here in front of Congress and the American people, will you take the pledge that Google will not adopt the bigoted anti-police policy that is requested in the most recent letter?
Congressman, we have a long track record of working with law enforcement when it is supported by due process and the law. We push back against overbroad requests. We are transparent about the requests we get, but we have a long history of following the law and cooperating with law enforcement.
I understand the history. I'm asking about the future. To the law enforcement that are watching today, can they rest assured that under your leadership, Google will not adopt these bigoted anti-police policies?
Congressman, we are committed to continuing to work with law enforcement in a way that's consistent with law and due processes in the U.S.
Well, I greatly appreciate that, and I know that will be very comforting to the police who utilize your services. You mentioned earlier in the discussion about China that your engagement in China was very limited, but yet Google has an AI China Center. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has published a paper saying that enhanced the targeting capabilities of China's J-20 fighter aircraft. You collaborate with Chinese universities that take millions upon millions of dollars from the Chinese military. Matter of fact, one of your Googlers, Fifi Li, while under your employ, was cited in Chinese state media saying, "China is like a sleeping giant. When she wakes, she will tremble the world." The former Secretary of Defense, Mr. Shanahan, said that the lines have been blurred in China between commercial and military application. And as Mr. Buck cited, General Dunford says that your company is directly aiding the Chinese military. And Peter Thiel, who actually serves on Mr. Zuckerberg's board at Facebook, said that Google's activities with China are treasonous. He accused you of treason. So why would an American company with American values so directly aid the Chinese military, but have ethical concerns about working alongside the US military on Project Maven? And I understand your point about cybersecurity and those things, but Project Maven was a specific way to ensure that our troops are safe on the battlefield. And if you have no problem making the J-20 Chinese fighter more effective in its targeting, why wouldn't you want to make America as effective?
Congressman, with respect, we are not working with the Chinese military. It's absolutely false. I had a chance to meet with General Dunford personally. We have clarified what we do in China compared to our peers. It's very, very limited in nature. our AI work in China is limited to a handful of people working on open source projects, and happy to share and engage with the office to explain our work in China further.
Gosh, I mean, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says that an American company is directly aiding China, when you have an AI center, when you're working with universities, and when your employees are talking about China trembling the world, it seems to really call into question your commitment to our country and our values. I see my time's expired. I hope we... Mr. Pichai, during our prior discussion earlier today, you said that Google doesn't work with the Chinese military. That answer was deceptive, because Google works with many of the entities that work with the Chinese military in common collaboration. And just as one example would be Tsinghua University, where Jeff Dean, who is the head of Google AI, served on the Computer Science Advisory Committee for the university. And then the university takes nearly $15 million from China's Central Military Commission. So you can see how, even if you don't literally show up at the offices of the Chinese military, if you're all showing up at the same place, working together on AI, that would lead to my concern. But I want to talk about search, because that's an area where I know Google has real market dominance. On December 11th, you testified to the Judiciary Committee, and in response to a question from my colleague Zoe Lofgren about search, you said, "We don't manually intervene on any particular search result." But leaked memos obtained by the Daily Caller show that that isn't true. In fact, those memos were altered December 3rd, just a week before your testimony, and they describe a deceptive news blacklist and a process for developing that blacklist approved by Ben Gomes, who leads search with your company, and also something called a fringe ranking, which seems to beg the question, who gets to decide what's fringe? And in your answer, you said to Ms. Lofgren that there is no manual intervention of search. That was your testimony, and now I'm going to cite specifically from this memo from the Daily Caller. It says that the Daily Caller obtained from your company. It says the beginning of the workflow starts when a website is placed on a watch list. It continues, this watch list is maintained and stored by Eris with access restricted to policy and enforcement specialists. Sort of does beg the question who these enforcement specialists are. Access to the listing can also be shared on a need-to-know basis to enforce or enrich the policy violations. The investigation of the watch list is done in the tool Athena, the Ares manual review tool. So you said to Congresswoman Lofgren that there was no manual review tool, and then your documents indicate that there is a manual review tool. So help us understand the inconsistency.
Congressman, there are two parts to this. In general, we algorithmically approach our search results. We have robust policies to do so, and we test it both with user feedback and we use raters to validate. Last year alone, we ran over 300,000 experiments and launched around 3,000 improvements to search. And we don't manually tune. The question last time was in the context of, is there someone behind the curtain, manually tuning an individual search result? We don't. We generally approach it algorithmically. We, however, in order to comply with the law in every country we operate in, for example, there may be an actor or a website identified as interfering in elections, and we then have to put that site on a list so that doesn't appear in our search results against queries. So other examples would be violent extremism.
And is that done manually, Mr. Pichai? That process you described, is that done manually?
And we could get reports from law enforcement agencies. We are complying with, or it's a known DMCA-based.
There is either a manual component or there is not a manual component. Which is it?
For creating those lists, that process can involve manual portions.
Okay, great. Well, that is sort of the concern that I have. You've now said something different today than you said to Ms. Lofgren, because you've confessed that there is a manual component to the way in which you blacklist content. And it seems to be no coincidence that it's sites like Gateway Pundit, The Western Journal, American Spectator, Daily Caller, and Breitbart that receive the ire or the negative treatment as a consequence of your manual tooling. And it also seems noteworthy that whistleblowers at your own company have spoken out. You said that one of the reasons you maintain this manual tool is to stop election interference. I believe it is in fact your company that is engaging in election interference. And it's not just my view. Mike Wacker came out and was a whistleblower indicating that the manual blacklist targets that Google specifically goes after are those who support President Trump, who hold a conservative viewpoint, and he left your company in 2019 because he was speaking out against these outrage mobs. So can you see how when you empower individuals, some of the same individuals that Project Veritas has exposed as labeling people as terrorists who say make America great again or who support the president, that in fact can be the very election interference that we're concerned about, and that you're using your market dominance in search to accomplish that election interference?
Congressman, with respect, I strongly disagree with that characterization. We don't approach this work with any political viewpoint. We do that to comply with law, known copyright violations, very in narrow circumstances, and we have to do that to comply with the law. And in many cases, those requests can come from law enforcement agencies.
Your own employees are saying you're doing it for a different reason. Your own employees are saying it's political bias. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr.
And I'm sorry, may I be recognized for unanimous consent request?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, just given the productivity of our discussion, I'd request that we be permitted a third round of questioning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, in 2016, there was an internal Google meeting. You attended that meeting along with Sergey Brin. A video of that meeting was leaked to Breitbart, and at the meeting, top Google executives, including Kent Walker, lamented Trump's victory. They compared Trump voters to extremists, and it was discussed that there was an intent to make the Trump win a blip in the populist movement in American history. Now, I know you've testified today in response to my questions and Mr. Jordan's questions that you don't intend this time to engage in electioneering on behalf of the former vice president. But given the video evidence of senior members of your team in your presence saying that they had the intent to make the Trump victory a blip, why should we believe that testimony today?
We do not have a view on, we respect the democratic process. We are deeply committed to it. As a company, we take pride in the information we provide to help people participate in free elections. And we are deeply committed to it, as I said to Congressman Jordan as well.
Do you remember that meeting? 2016 that you attended?
Yes, I do. It was in the context of, through the election across both sides, there was a lot of opinions, and as you know, elections are kind of a polarizing moment generally in the country, and there was a lot of rhetoric about certain issues which were
I understand rhetoric. I guess the question is, when the senior members of your team in your presence said that they did have the intent to change the outcome in a subsequent election. And then since that moment in time where we've seen all of these conservative websites and conservative viewpoints censored, you can understand why people would be concerned. So after your employees and top executives said in your presence that they intended to make the Trump victory a blip, what action did you take as the CEO to protect and preserve the neutrality of your platform?
Congressman, no one had a view on ever interfering with elections or so on. But what I can tell you is we've made it very clear about 2 years ago, we announced new community guidelines for within Google, clearly making it clear that employees obviously are free to have their political views, but none of that they shouldn't bring that as they work on any of our products. And if we found any evidence that people are using a political agenda to manipulate any of our content platforms, we would take strong enforcement action.
We have sort of a string of events here. We have the 2016 meeting where people demonstrated their intent to make changes to hurt the president. Then we have your testimony today that's a little different than your testimony from December, where you say people can manipulate blacklists. And then you have the outcome where sites like Breitbart and Gateway Pundit and others see that disparate treatment. So it really doesn't take Sherlock Holmes here to connect the dots and see what Google's doing.
Mr. Pichai, I'd like to start with you, and I'm just going to illustrate my question with a factual incident that actually occurred to me. Several months ago, my wife called and said, hey, there's a good article on the Gateway Pundit that you should read. So out of curiosity, I was up here in Washington. Out of curiosity, I Googled Gateway Pundit. And it didn't show up on the first page, didn't show up on the second page. There was a bunch of different blogging sites about how there were disagreements with what was on the Gateway Pundit. But I actually had to type in gatewaypundit.com to get to it. Interestingly, Google didn't allow me to get to the actual website. That was a couple of months ago, before this hearing was set to be heard, before this hearing was noticed, before you knew that you would be appearing before us today, and that this is an issue that obviously conservatives and Republicans have had. Last week, after this was noticed, this hearing was noticed, I did the exact same thing here in the Capitol. And wouldn't you know it, I Googled Gateway Pundit, and that was the very first website that came up. Now, this isn't from a constituent in my district. This isn't from somebody telling me. This isn't a news report. I actually physically did this on my laptop here in the Capitol several months ago and then today. So clearly, something had happened between not being notified that you were going to be appearing before our committee and then last week knowing that you would be appearing before our committee, and suddenly conservative websites are now at the top of the bar when you search for them. So was there anything done at Google between a couple of months ago and last week or the week before you appearing today that has changed your approach to silencing conservative websites?
Congressman, we approach our work with a deep sense of responsibility, in a nonpartisan way. We want to serve all our users, no matter where they are. In fact, it's in our long-term business incentive to do so. And I believe on our platforms, including YouTube, there are more conservative voices than ever before, and we believe in freedom of expression. On the specific issue, I will have to look into it. I obviously wasn't aware of it. We do. It could be a number of reasons. We constantly get reports.
So if you're going to look into it for me, can I expect a response from you, say, in the next 2 weeks as to why that occurred?
Congressman, we'll do our best to follow up, and I'll engage with your office to respond.
We'll follow up on that. I've got a similar question. So I've been in elected politics for almost 10 years. And when I was in the Florida Senate and the state Senate, I never had a problem with my campaign emails being marked as spam or going to junk folders or anything along those lines. And we had 30, 40, 50,000 people on our email list. And suddenly I get elected to Congress, and I'm now up here in Washington, D.C., and my parents who have a Gmail account aren't getting my campaign emails. My supporters, just last week, one of my supporters called me and said, hey, I just want you to know this, that my Gmail account suddenly is taking your campaign emails that I've received for almost 10 years, and suddenly they're going to spam and junk folders. This appears to only be happening to conservative Republicans. I don't see anything in the news or anything in the press or other members on the other side of the aisle talking about their campaign emails getting thrown into junk folders in Gmail. So my question is why is this only happening to Republicans? And it's a fact, it's happening because I can have my supporters testify that they've received my emails for 9 years, and suddenly this last year, all of their Gmail, my campaign emails in their Gmail are going to their spam folder. So if you could give me some clarification on that, I would appreciate it.
In Gmail, we are focused on what users want, and users have indicated they want us to organize their personal emails they receive from friends and family separately. And so all we have done is we have a tabbed organization, and the primary tab has emails from friends and family, and the secondary tab has other notifications and so on. These things
it was my father who was not receiving now my campaign emails. So clearly that familial thing that you're talking about didn't apply to my emails.
Our systems probably are not able to understand that that it's your father. Obviously, we don't have that context there. We just apply it neutrally across all organizations
what assurances can you give me that there's my time's short. One last question. What assurances can you give me that any bias amongst your employees isn't influencing your spam folder algorithms?
Congressman, there's nothing in the algorithm which has anything to do with political ideology, and we do get complaints across the aisle. For example, the World Socialist Review complained in January of this year that their site wasn't found in Google search results. And so we get complaints, we look into it, but we approach our work in a nonpartisan way, and it's in our long-term incentive to serve users across the country. And today, that's why we invest in our radars in 49 states across the U.S. so that we can capture all viewpoints.
Let me just say, just for the record, I'm a Democrat from Florida, and I've had heard complaints about my emails going into spam as well, and I'm sure other Democratic members have had the same experiences, unfortunately. Mr. Pichai, in 2007, Google purchased DoubleClick, the leading provider of certain advertising tools. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congresswoman.
When Google proposed the merger, alarm bells were raised about the access to data Google would have, specifically the ability to connect a user's personal identity with their browsing activity. Google, however, committed to Congress and to the antitrust enforcers that the deal would not reduce user privacy. Google chief legal advisor testified before the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee that Google wouldn't be able to merge this data even if it wanted to, given contractual restrictions. But in June of 2016, Google went ahead and merged this data anyway, effectively destroying anonymity on the internet. Mr. Pichai, you became CEO of Google in 2015, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, and this change was made in 2016, is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you for that. Did you sign off on this decision to combine the sets of data with that Google had told Congress would be kept separate?
Congresswoman, any changes we made,
Mr. Pichai, with all due respect, please, did you sign off on the decision or not?
I review at a high level all important decisions we make. We deeply care about privacy and security of our users.
So you signed off on the decision?
User consent for.
Okay, you signed off on the decision. Practically, this decision meant that your company would not combine would now combine, for example, all of my data on Google, my search history, my location from Google Maps, information from my emails from Gmail, as well as my personal identity with the record of almost all of the websites I visited. That is absolutely staggering. According to an email from a DoubleClick executive, that was exactly the type of reduction in user privacy that Google's founders had previously worried would lead to a backlash. And I quote, "They were unwavering on the policy due to philosophical reasons, which is Larry and Sergey's fundamentally not wanting users associated with a cross-site cookie. They were also worried about a privacy storm as well as damage to Google's brand." So in 2007, Google's founders feared making this change because they knew it would upset their users. But in 2016, Google didn't seem to care. Mr. Pichai, isn't it true that what changed between 2007 and 2016 is that Google gained enormous market power? So while Google had to care about user privacy in 2007, it no longer had to in 2016. Would you agree that what changed was Google gained enormous market power?
Congresswoman, this is an important issue. If I could explain. Well, we today make it very easy for users to be in control of their data. We have simplified their settings. They can turn ads personalization on or off. We have combined most of activity settings into 3 groupings. We remind users to go do a privacy checkup. 1 billion users have done so.
Okay, Mr. Pichai, thank you so much for that. I am concerned that Google's bait and switch with DoubleClick is part of a broader pattern where Google buys up companies for the purposes of surveilling Americans, and because of Google's dominance, users have no choice but to surrender. In 2019, Google made over 80% of its total revenue through selling of ad placement. Is that correct, Mr. Pichai? About 80%? Yeah, okay. And because Google sells behavioral ads targeted to each of us as individuals, the more user data that Google collects, the more money Google can make. More user data means more money. Is that correct?
In general, that's not true. For example, when
More
you come
user
in,
data,
when you type,
not the more
most
money
of the data
Google
we need is built into
collects?
the
I'm sorry, please. So you're saying that the more user data, it does not mean the more money that Google can collect.
Congresswoman, most of the data today we collect is to help users and provide personalized experiences back. Ad
Okay,
data
thank you so much, Mr. Pichai. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee.
I want to start by saying that capitalism is the greatest instrument for freedom this world has ever seen. Capitalism has given the United States the freedom and means to defeat the Soviet Union, beat back fascism, and put a man on the moon. This economic system has lifted millions out of poverty. It has made America the freest, most prosperous nation in the world. Our witnesses have taken ideas born out of a dorm room, a garage, a warehouse, and built these dreams into 4 of the biggest power players in the digital global economy. You have all enjoyed the freedom to succeed. Now, let me be clear. I do not believe big is necessarily bad. In fact, big is often a force for good. However, I want to address one particularly disturbing issue. Mr. Pichai, in October 2018, Google dropped out of the running for a Pentagon contract to complete the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, or JEDI contract, which was valued at more than $10 billion. Google's stated reason for removing itself from the bidding process is that the U.S. military's project did not align with Google's corporate values and principles. This is the same U.S. military that fights for our freedoms and stands as a force for good across the globe. These are the same soldiers, sailors, and airmen that sacrifice their lives to ensure you have the freedom to build your company and set your corporate policies without fear of government interference, unlike in communist China. I also find it very interesting that only months after making this decision to withdraw from the JEDI contract, Marine General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned the Senate Armed Forces Committee that the Chinese military was directly benefiting from Google's work. It made me wonder what values Google and communist Red China had in common. I asked myself, is it that the Chinese Communist Party imprisons Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, like it is shown on the chart behind me? Could it be that China forces slaves to work in sweatshops? Maybe they align on the design to suppress free speech in Hong Kong. Did Google agree with CCP's decision to lie to the world about the COVID-19 pandemic? Then I thought about Google's Dragonfly experiment. I wondered if perhaps you agreed with the Chinese government's use of technology platforms to spy on its own people and enforce draconian security laws. Maybe it's that your company is aligned with the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage policies, where the strategy is to steal whatever can't be produced domestically. These values that allow Google to work with the Chinese military but not the US military help explain why Google wouldn't think twice about blatantly stealing a competitor's product, right down to the watermark, without any hint of attribution. Mr. Pichai, during our field hearing in my home state of Colorado, I heard a story that sounded so brazen and contrary to free market principles that I thought it must have been straight from the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage playbook. Google took advantage of a company that relied on your search engine to build its brand and compete. Google misappropriated lyrics from Genius Media Group's website and published those lyrics on Google's own platform. However, Genius caught Google in the act, quite literally red-handed. When Genius suspected this corporate theft was occurring, the company incorporated a digital watermark in its lyrics that spelled out red-handed. In Morse code, Google's lyric boxes contained the watermark, showing that your company stole what you couldn't or didn't want to produce yourself. After Google executives stated that they were investigating this problematic behavior, Genius created another experiment to determine the scope of the misappropriation. It turns out that out of 271 songs where the watermark was applied, 43% showed clear evidence of matching. Your company, which advertises itself as a doorway to freedom, took advantage of this small company, all but extinguishing Genius's freedom to compete. Google is supposed to connect people to information. Your corporate values once stood for freedom, a platform that let capitalism flourish and helped bring countless people across the globe out of poverty. My question to you, Mr. Pichai, do you think that Google could get away with following China's corporate espionage playbook if you didn't have a monopolistic advantage in the market?
Congressman, I want to be able to address the important concerns you raised. First of all, we are proud to support the U.S. government. We recently signed a big project with the Department of Defense where we are bringing our world-class zero trust-based cybersecurity approach to help protect Pentagon networks from cybersecurity attacks. We have projects underway with the Navy, with Department of Veterans Affairs. Happy to follow up and explain more. We have a very limited presence in China. We don't offer any of our services, search, maps, Gmail, YouTube, etc. in China. And with respect to music, we license content there. In fact, we license content from other companies. And so this is a dispute between Genius and the other companies in terms of where the source of the content is. But again, happy to engage and explain what we do here further.
Google has received criticism about bias against conservatives and content moderation. There were threats of demonetizing the Federalist and numerous other complaints of viewpoint suppression. As a result, a significant portion of the American public has lost trust in your company. A lack of public confidence in a product usually means there is economic harm to the company. But that just isn't the case with Google. So I think it's a legitimate question as to whether Google's market power insulates it from loss of revenue normally associated with offending half the people who use your product. I also think it's a legitimate question to ask if other attempts to regulate your industries have worked. So, Mr. Pichai, Google has restricted advertising analytics or the portability of user data related to advertising due to compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation. Specifically, in 2018, Google restricted the ability to export the double ID, a cookie-based identifier that compiles individual user data and creates profiles through Google data transfer. Is that correct?
Congressman, not familiar with the specifics of that particular issue, but happy to follow up more once I understand it better.
So you're not particularly familiar with how you're complying with GDPR?
Congressman, we've long been working to comply with GDPR. We think it's an important regulation, and we are in full compliance to the extent of my knowledge. I just meant I'm not aware of that specific issue with the identifier you mentioned there, but happy to understand it better and follow up.
All right, so in order to comply with GDPR, Google must retain control over more user data and restrict the ability to combine this user data with other platforms to conduct cross-platform analysis. It seems as if that ultimately limits the ability of advertisers to make comparisons between Google-based campaigns and non-Google-based campaigns. Would you agree with that?
In all these ecosystems, we are balancing between users, advertisers, and publishers. We deeply care about the privacy and security of our users. And so when we serve these ecosystems, we have to take that into account. We have to comply with important laws and regulations in every country we operate in. And so that's the delicate balance we are constantly striking. But we are focused on our users and trying to do the best we can.
And I just want to be perfectly clear. I personally believe that just the market power consolidation is significant, but I also want to be clear that when we're moving forward to regulate this, that we aren't actually squeezing out competition in our quest to do something. Because I've said that before in this hearing, and I'll say it again. Usually in our quest to regulate big companies, we end up hurting small companies more. And I'm a strong privacy advocate, but the consequences of GDPR have been to further entrench large established actors like Google, leading to regulatory capture that exasperates competition concerns. And Google's digital ad market share has increased since the implementation of GDPR. Do you know that to be correct?
Congressman, to just give you a sense of the robust competition we see, ad prices have fallen down by 40% in the past 10 years. And in fact, in the US, advertising as a share of GDP has come down from 1.4% in 1992, less than 1% today. So we see robust competition in the marketplace. And as I said earlier, we have to comply with regulation. We have to interpret it strictly, and we have to balance the ecosystem. But our utmost care is ensuring privacy and security of our users. as we serve these markets.
And I'm glad you mentioned privacy, because I would be remiss if I didn't deal with this issue, because it is so relevant. And I think generally speaking, outside of the political issues and the biases with all of this, and this is for essentially all four of our witnesses, I think one of our bigger concerns when we talk about data and value, and that data having value and privacy, which is where people really get concerned with how the digital age is moving forward. And there are news reports that law enforcement has made increasing use of what are called geofence warrants. And these geofence warrants allow authorities to compel technology companies to disclose location records for any device in a certain area at a particular time. Court filings suggest that Google received a 1,500% increase in geofence requests from 2017 to 2018, and a 500% increase from 2018 till 2019. The Fourth Amendment requires probable cause and specificity, and that's not what these are. These warrants are essentially for any person in an area at a particular time, and geofence warrants require neither. So unless accompanied by particularized information and identifying a subject, geo warrants are essentially general warrants. I believe that the location information should be considered as contents of the Electronic Communications Act under the Stored Communications Act. Do you agree?
Happy to understand more. We deeply care about this. Is why we issue transparency reports, because we think it's an important area for Congress to have oversight. And we recently made a change by which we automatically delete location activity after a certain period of time by default for our users. So we are happy to engage with your office, Congressman, and
I'm using you because these are going on in Virginia and New York, I think, right now. But I mean, this equates for everything. I think people would be terrified to know that law enforcement could grab general warrants and get everybody's information anywhere. So it requires Congress to act, and it requires everybody that is a witness in this hearing to be willing to work too, because it is the single most important issue I think we're going to.
Time of the gentleman has expired, but I believe he has a unanimous consent request.
I do. I have unanimous consent request for a Wall Street Journal article, police request for Google users' location histories face new scrutiny.
Without objection.
And then I have two letters. The letters are from Congressman Walden, Congresswoman McMorris Rogers. The first letter is to Mr. Cook of Apple. The second letter is to Mr. Pichai.
Without objection,
Google.
both may be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentleman.
Earlier this year, Google announced plans to retire third-party cookies that websites attach to users' browsers. And this allows users to be tracked across the internet. A consequence of that change is that it will put other digital advertising market participants at a disadvantage because they can no longer track users. And at the very, very danger of being pro-cookie, because I'm not when I use my computer as well. And I understand that there are legitimate privacy concerns with third-party cookies, but I do want to focus on the competition aspect. Did this asset action also place Google at a disadvantage, or does Google have alternative means of collecting that user data to inform its digital advertising activities, Mr. Pichai?
Congressman, as you rightly pointed out, this is an area where we are focused on user privacy, and users clearly don't want to be tracked with third-party cookies. In fact, other browser vendors, including from Apple and Mozilla Foundation, have also implemented these changes. We are doing it thoughtfully, giving time for the industry to adapt, because we know publishers depend on revenue in this area. But it's an important change, and I think we have to be focused on privacy to drive the change forward.
But you have other ways of collecting that information, correct?
On our first-party services, we don't rely on cookies, and obviously when people come and type into search.
I'm not asking you if you rely on cookies. I'm asking you if you have other ways of collecting it through Gmail or consumer-facing platforms, right?
We don't use data from Gmail for ads, Congressman, but to the extent on the services where we provide ads, and if users have consented to ads personalization, yes, we do have data.
Mr. Pichai, in 2015, Google announced that it would not allow third parties to buy YouTube ads via AdX. That means that ad buys on YouTube are conducted only through Google demand-side products. Google justified this change by citing privacy and user experience. My understanding is that Google cited a concern that third-party digital ad participants would develop user profiles based on this viewing. It is also my understanding that even under the Gdpr, you allow users to provide consent, which would authorize this type of activity. It seems that that this policy, regardless of the privacy concerns, reduced competition for demand-side platforms on YouTube. Do you agree?
Congressman, we're always looking to improve the YouTube experience. Part of being able to integrate this way is why in YouTube we've been able to innovate with something called TrueView ads. So for users, we give them skippable ads. If they find the ads not to be relevant, they can skip past those ads. And monetizing YouTube well is what allows. Today we have many, literally hundreds of thousands of creators earning a livelihood, and many of them are small and medium businesses.
Yep.
So we want to support that well, and so we are focused on that. Allowing this type of integration is what allows us to create that user experience.
But after Google stopped allowing third parties to buy YouTube ads via AdX, Google limited the interoperability of third-party analytics on YouTube. You now require the use of ads on Data Hub. Again, the justification is based on user privacy. Other ad market participants may not have access to that data, but it doesn't disappear, does it?
Congressman, this is consistent with how today many services, be it Facebook or Snapchat or Pinterest, you work with their ad tools to buy ads on their properties.
Well, I understand that, but the excuse is privacy, but the data doesn't disappear. You just have greater control over it, right?
Congressman, it's a service we provide to our users. We obviously want to make sure we protect the privacy of users there. We do monetize with ads. We give users a choice of either consuming it as a subscription service or using it with ads. And we've been very focused on making YouTube a great platform for creators. And I think the model is working well. And it's really helped many small and medium businesses to invest on the platform and grow their businesses.
So you, regardless of the intent was to lessen competition or not, the action resulted in smaller competitors unable to participate in placing ads on YouTube. Isn't that correct? Congressman,
we see robust choice for advertisers. There is several alternatives. There is obviously Facebook suite of products. There is Amazon with their ads marketplace. There is companies like Snapchat, Pinterest, Twitter. There are new competitors who have emerged, and this is why we have seen advertising costs decline by 40% in the last 10 years. And so we see dynamism in the marketplace. We are focused on it.
Yeah, but here's my issue, and there are policies that actually protect user privacy. Apple's encryption policy. Microsoft just came out on facial recognition policy. My concern is that is that when we're using privacy, we're trying to use privacy and we're using privacy as a shield, but what we're really doing and what your company's really doing is using it as a cudgel to beat down the competition. And when we're talking about privacy, it's a great word that people care about, but not when it's utilized to control more of the marketplace and squeeze out smaller competitors. And with that,
Mr. Pichai, over 85% of all online searches go through Google. Every online company in the United States depends on Google to reach users. A business may sink or swim based on Google's decisions alone. Numerous online businesses told us that Google steals their content and privileges its own sites in ways that profit Google but crush everyone else. Most businesses asked to stay anonymous due to fears that Google would retaliate against them. One entrepreneur, Brian Warner, told us his website was thriving until Google stole his content. After Google's decision, traffic to his website dropped by 80%. He had to downsize his business and lay off half his staff. He told us, and I quote, "If someone came to me with an idea for a website or a web service today, I'd tell them to run as far away from the web as possible. Launch a lawn care business or dog grooming business, something Google can't take away as soon as he or she is thriving." So my first question, Mr. Pichai, is why does Google steal content from honest businesses?
Mr. Chairman, with respect, I disagree with that characterization. Just last week, I met with many small businesses. In fact, today we support 1.4 million small businesses, supporting over $385 billion in economic activity. We see many businesses thrive, particularly even during the pandemic. Businesses, an example, Kettle Kings in Texas, which sells kettlebells. They've really
Mr. Pichai, I have a
expanded.
limited amount of time, so I don't want to interrupt you, but my question is very specific. We heard throughout this investigation that Google has stolen content to build your own business. These are consistent reports, and so your testimony that doesn't happen is really inconsistent with what we've learned during the course of the investigation, but I'll move on to a new question. Mr. Pichai, most Americans believe that when they enter a search query that what Google shows are the most relevant results. But increasingly, Google just shows whatever is most profitable for Google, be it Google Ads or Google's own sites. And so my question, Mr. Pichai, isn't there a fundamental conflict of interest between serving users who want to access the best and most relevant information and Google's business model, which incentivizes Google to sell ads and keep users on Google's own sites?
We've always focused on providing users the most relevant information, and we rely on the trust for users to come back to Google every day. In fact, a vast majority of queries in Google, we don't show ads at all, and we show ads only for a small subset of queries where the intent from users is highly commercial. For example, they may be looking for something like TV sets or so on.
But Mr. Pichai, what is the value of the part that you do use the Google ads for? I mean, it's a substantial part of your business. What's the actual value? 200 billion, 300 billion?
In terms of revenue, it's around 100 plus $100 billion. But
that's a lot of money, Mr. Pichai. Let me move on. Really, Mr. Pichai, it's Google's business model that is the problem. Our documents show that Google evolved from a turnstile to the rest of the web to a walled garden that increasingly keeps users within its sites. Emails show that over a decade ago, Google started to fear competition from certain websites, web pages that could divert search traffic and revenue from Google. These documents show that Google staff discussed the proliferating threat, is how it was described, that these web pages pose to Google. Any traffic lost to other sites was a loss in revenue. One of Google's memos observed that certain websites were getting, and I quote, too much traffic. So Google decided to put an end to that. Mr. Pichai, you've been at Google since 2004. Were you involved in these discussions about the threat from vertical search?
Congressman, without knowing the specifics, it's, I'm not fully clear of the context, but definitely when we look at vertical searches, it validates the competition we see. For example, when users come looking to shop online, independent studies show that over 55% of product searches originate with Amazon and over 70% originate with the major e-commerce companies. In the few categories which are commercial in nature, we see vigorous competition, be it travel, be it real estate, and we are working hard, focused
let me
on
ask very
users
specifically, Mr.
to innovate
Pichai.
there.
The evidence that we collected shows that Google pursued a multi-pronged attack. First, Google began to steal other web pages' content. For example, in 2010, Google stole restaurant reviews from Yelp to bootstrap its own rival local search business. Mr. Pichai, do you know how Google responded when Yelp asked you to stop stealing their reviews? Well, I'll tell you, our investigation shows that Google's response was to threaten to delist Yelp entirely. In other words, the choice Google gave Yelp was, let us steal your content or effectively disappear from the web. Mr. Pichai, isn't that anti-competitive?
Congressman, when I run the company, I'm really focused on giving users what they want. We conduct ourselves to the highest standard. Happy to engage, understand the specifics, and answer your questions further.
Thank you. And just one final series of questions, Mr. Pichai. Did Google ever use its surveillance over web traffic to identify competitive threats?
Congressman, just like other businesses, we try to understand trends from data which we can see, and we use it to improve our products for our users. But we are really focused on improving our products, and that's how search
I appreciate
works.
that, Mr. Pichai. Google's own documents and numerous interviews with companies affected by this conduct show that Google did just that, which is very disturbing and very anti-competitive. In addition to stealing content, Google also began to privilege its own sites. An investigative report published just yesterday found that 63% of web searches that start on Google also end somewhere on Google's own websites. And to me, that's evidence that Google is increasingly a walled garden, which keeps users on Google sites, even if Google doesn't have the most relevant information and it's economically catastrophic for other companies online. And so my time is running out, but Mr. Pichai, I'll just end by saying the evidence seems very clear to me. As Google became the gateway to the internet, it began to abuse its power. It used its surveillance over web traffic to identify competitive threats and crush them. It has dampened innovation and new business growth, and it's dramatically increased the price of accessing users on the internet, virtually ensuring that any business that wants to be found on the web must pay Google a tax.
Mr. Pichai, I direct my questions to you. Many of us feel a deep urgency to protect independent journalism, and I wanted to talk a little bit about ad revenue and independent journalism. Google makes most of its revenue through selling advertising, and Google's advertising exchange is a, quote, real-time marketplace to buy and sell display advertising space, correct?
Yes, Congressman, that's correct.
And over 2 million websites, including online newspapers, use that exchange, correct?
We are very proud to support publishers, and I don't have the exact numbers, but yes, that seems
well,
directionally
that's an estimate put forth by tech expert Dina Srinivasan. And your own website for Google Display Network says you have access to over 2 million sites. What is Google's share of the ad exchange market?
Congressman, I'm not exactly familiar. I've seen various reports, but we are a popular choice.
Great. Let me put it up for you. If you look at the screen, you will see that 50 to 60%, Google has 50 to 60% according to the Online Platforms and Digital Advertising CMA market study that was just released. And in order to buy and sell on these exchanges, websites and advertisers go through a middleman like Google's DV360 and Google Ads. If you look at the slide, Mr. Pichai, you can see that the share of this buy-side market that Google has is 50 to 90%, according to the same study. And I just want to simplify how these exchanges work. So, say in Seattle, Dee's Electronics, a mom-and-pop business, wants to buy online ad space in the Seattle Times. Dee's Electronics would need to go to a middleman like Google Ads, which would then bid for ad space on an ad exchange. And the problem is that Google controls all of these entities. So it's running the marketplace, it's acting on the buy side, and it's acting on the sell side at the same time, which is a major conflict of interest. It allows you to set rates very low as a buyer of ad space from newspapers, depriving them of their ad revenue, and then also to sell high to small businesses who are very dependent on advertising on your platform. It sounds a bit like a stock market, except unlike a stock market, there's no regulation on your ad exchange market. If there were regulation, it would actually prohibit insider trading, which means that the broker can't use the data in the broker division to buy and sell for their own interests. Instead, brokers have to serve their clients. Does Google have a similar obligation to serve its clients, the businesses that are selling and buying ad space?
Congresswoman, if I could explain this for a minute, we paid over $14 billion to publishers. We're deeply committed to journalism in this area. On an average, we pay out 69% of the revenue when publishers use Google's buy and sell side tools. And out of it, it's a low margin business for us. We do it because we want to help support publishers in this area.
I understand that, Mr. Pichai. What I'm trying to get at is when any company controls the buy and the sell side, I worked on Wall Street a very long time ago, there are reasons that insider trading is regulated, and this ad exchange is essentially the same thing. And without accountability, it isn't meaningful to just care about the newspapers. We're seeing them die all over, and ad revenue is a big reason. Let me put up a graph here that shows that Google's ad revenue is increasingly coming from ads on Google-owned sites and less so from other websites. Can you explain that trend?
I can't quite see whether this is net revenue or gross revenue. Obviously, when it comes to non-Google properties, we share the majority of revenue back to publishers. Whereas on our own properties, we obviously, we have the inventory. So, but I would need to understand more. I just quickly looked at it. I'm not sure if
we can send it. We can send it to you and make sure you have it. Google has not made its search traffic volumes public in years, so there's no way for us to know exactly what's happening here, and there's no way for businesses to verify whether they've been treated fairly or left behind in favor of Google-owned companies. Is Google steering advertising revenue to Google Search?
Congresswoman, users come to Google Search. It is that traffic, and that's where our source of revenue comes from. So we are focused on providing users the information they are looking for. We work hard to earn their trust. We know competition for information is just a click away.
Thank you, Mr. Pichai. I just want to make the point that independent journalism is incredibly necessary to our democracy, and we want to do what we can to protect it.
Mr. Pichai, I wanted to focus a little bit on Google's acquisition of YouTube and some of the consequences of that move for consumer privacy and competition. Now, Google purchased YouTube in 2006 after identifying it as a potential rival that could eventually draw business away from Google. And it's my understanding Google paid $1.65 billion for that acquisition, nearly 30 times its original bid of $50 million. So could you tell us why Google was willing to pay so much more beyond the initial proposed bid? And was this as a result of any analysis on the harm Google would suffer if a competitor had purchased YouTube?
Congresswoman, we acquired YouTube in 2006, and this was well before my time there as CEO, and I wasn't directly involved. But what I do recall at the time is that we saw it as a new emerging area, and our mission is to help users with information. We saw an opportunity, and it wasn't clear. YouTube only had 67 people.
Okay, was Mr. Page in charge of that decision?
Congresswoman, I wasn't directly involved, but I am pretty sure our senior leadership team at that time definitely looked into it.
Okay, I would encourage the subcommittee to take the steps necessary to have us hear from whoever was in charge of that. Moving on, Google is now by far the top online site where Americans watch videos, including children's videos. And as I'm sure you're aware, federal law prevents companies from collecting data on children under 13. However, just last year, the Federal Trade Commission found that Google had spent years knowingly collecting data on children under 13 on YouTube and offering advertisers the ability to target those children directly. Mr. Pichai, did YouTube use the data it illegally acquired to improve its ability to target ads to children?
We are, this is an area, I take it very seriously. I'm a parent too. We are committed. We have invested tremendously. We have a dedicated product for kids in YouTube Kids. On the main YouTube platform, we make sure we have clear policies. We enforce them rigorously. Just in Q4 of 2019, we flagged and removed almost close to 1 million videos, potentially for concerns around child safety. So it's an area we are investing rigorously and will continue to do so.
Well, I'm more concerned about the fact that you're investing rigorously in luring in advertisers like toy makers, Mattel, and Hasbro by telling them that YouTube is the #1 website regularly visited by kids. So that sounds like you're targeting the kids and then targeting advertisers to bring them on board. Is that correct?
Today, in the main site of YouTube, we don't allow anyone under 13 to create accounts. There are scenarios in which there could be family viewing, and today there are creators who create content oriented towards families, and as part of that, there are advertisers which are interested in connecting with those users. But everything we do here, we obviously comply with all the applicable regulations. And
okay, well, let's look at some of the content that is specifically for children. COPPA makes it illegal to target those kids, but we've got an issue where content creators are in a very difficult position now. So if a show like Sesame Street doesn't want to show ads for junk food on YouTube, does YouTube allow it to make that choice?
Today, we do, we have choices both for creators in terms of, tools and preferences, and we have extensive tools for advertisers, and above all for users, we give a choice. They can either use YouTube as a subscription service without seeing those types of ads, or they can use it for free with ads. So we give choice, and for us, it is of utmost importance that YouTube is a place where people come to learn, and we find increasingly small and medium businesses use YouTube to thrive, especially even during COVID, particularly met with many
Let's go back
businesses
to content that's designed for children. So, if there's an organization like Sesame Street that wants to provide child-centered content, but they don't want that content to be sullied, shall we say, with junk food ads or something. My understanding is that you say that the content creators can do that, but we've got a recent report from the Wall Street Journal that says YouTube hasn't been honoring those requests, and it's been making it difficult for independent auditing companies like OpenSlate to independently audit that and then report back to those content creators about whether or not YouTube is honoring those. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the particular report, but I'm happy to understand it better and have my office follow up with your staff, Congressman.
I would appreciate that. My time has expired. I yield back.
Mr. Pichai, similarly, there was an article just yesterday, from The Verge. The title is "Google Reportedly Keeps Tabs on Usage of Rival Android Apps to Develop Competitors." And I'll quote from the article. Google said that the data doesn't give information about how people behave while they're using individual apps, but it wouldn't say whether it had been used to develop competing apps. So I guess first, I take it you would confirm that Google does have access to confidential information or ultimately competitively sensitive information about apps on the Android devices?
Congressman, if I could clarify this. Today, we have an API which is available for other developers as long as users consent. This gives us system health metrics. This is how we can launch digital well-being features on Android. This is how we understand which apps are using battery, and we can give a dashboard which shows, maybe for crashing or quality control or for battery usage or for digital well-being. So at a high level, this data is available through a public API, and other developers can avail as long as the users give consent to it.
So, Mr. Pichai, I just want to clarify, again, I'll quote from this article. The article refers to this data as sensitive data about other apps, including how often they're opened and for how long they're used. I'm not asking how you use that information. I'm just asking whether or not, in fact, what the article alleges it is correct, that you do have access to that data. With user consent and the APIs exist, yes, we do. And does Google use
And it's critical for us to have access to that so that we can maintain this is how we understand and we can, improve resource usage of applications.
Understood.
We can have features like.
My time's limited, sorry. I just want to get to this core question. Given that Google does have access to that data, does Google use that data to develop competing apps? And if your answer is no, will Google commit to making the necessary changes within its Android developer app agreements to ensure that developers have that sense of clarity that in fact the data will not be used for Google to be able to develop a competing application?
Congressman, like other businesses today, we do look at trends, and we, in fact, in Play Store, we do publish the number of installs of application, and we give ranges. And so there's a wide variety of way by which we try to understand what's happening in the market. But I appreciate your concern about making sure there's clarity in this area, and we'll continue to invest and give more clarity.
Yeah, I guess, want to just follow very quickly, Mr. Chairman, if you're willing. So I guess I'm wondering if you can just answer that fundamental question. Does Google use that information to develop competing apps? I understand the purposes you've described in terms of how you use the information. I'm just asking if one of those, in fact, is to develop competing apps.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Congressman, because we try to understand what's going on in market and we are aware of popularity of apps, I don't want to. I want to be accurate in my answer, but in general, the primary use for that data is to improve the health of Android. But and any data we get, we have user consent for it, and we make it available through an API to other developers as well. At its heart, a discussion about competition is a discussion about opportunity. This has never been more important as the global pandemic poses dual challenges to our health and our economy. Expanding access to opportunity through technology is personal to me. I didn't have much access to a computer growing up in India. So you can imagine my amazement when I arrived in the US for graduate school and saw an entire lab of computers to use whenever I wanted. Accessing the internet for the first time set me on a path to bring technology to as many people as possible. It inspired me to build Google's first browser, Chrome. I'm proud that 11 years later, so many people experience the web through Chrome for free. Google takes pride in the number of people who choose our products. We are even prouder of what they do with them. From the 140 million students and teachers using G Suite for education to stay connected during the pandemic, to the 5 million Americans gaining digital skills through Grow with Google, to all the people who turn to Google for help, from finding the fastest route home to learning how to cook a new dish on YouTube. Google's work would not be possible without the long tradition of American innovation, and we are proud to contribute to its future. We employ more than 75,000 people in the US across 26 states. The Progressive Policy Institute estimated that in 2018, we invested more than $20 billion in the US, citing us as the largest capital investor in America that year, and one of the top 5 for the last 3 years. One way we contribute is by building helpful products. Research found that free services like search, Gmail, Maps, and Photos provide thousands of dollars a year in value to the average American. And many are small businesses using our digital tools to grow. Stone Dimensions, a family-owned stone company in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, uses Google My Business to draw more customers. Gills Appliances, a family-owned appliance store in Bristol, Rhode Island, credits Google Analytics with helping them reach customers online during the pandemic. Nearly 1/3 of small business owners say that without digital tools, they would have had to close all or part of their business during COVID. Another way we contribute is by being among the world's biggest investors in research and development. At the end of 2019, our R&D spend had increased tenfold over 10 years, from $2.8 billion to $26 billion. And we have invested over $90 billion the last 5 years. Our engineers are helping America remain a global leader in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and quantum computing. Just as America's technology leadership is not inevitable, Google's continued success is not guaranteed. New competitors emerge every day, and today users have more access to information than ever before. Competition drives us to innovate, and it also leads to better products, lower choices, and more choices for everyone. For example, competition helped lower online advertising costs by 40% over the last decade, with savings passed down to consumers. Open platforms like Android also support the innovation of others. Using Android, thousands of mobile operators build and sell their own devices without paying any licensing fees to us. This has enabled billions of consumers to afford cutting-edge smartphones, some for less than $50. Whether building tools for small businesses or platforms like Android, Google succeeds when others succeed. Competition also sets higher standards for privacy and security. I've always believed that privacy is a universal right, and Google is committed to keeping your information safe, treating it responsibly, putting you in control, and we've long supported the creation of comprehensive federal privacy laws. I've never forgotten how access to technology and innovation changed the course of my life. Google aims to build products that increase access to opportunity for everyone, no matter where you live, what you believe, or how much money you earn. We are committed to doing this responsibly in partnership with lawmakers to ensure every American has access to the incredible opportunity technology creates. Thank you.